Glory be to God on high, and peace be to all God's people. Look, thank you for letting me speak into this really difficult debate that we're having in our society about euthanasia or the right to assisted dying. Probably what's on the top of most people's minds is that kind of extreme situation of human suffering for which euthanasia is suggested as the only appropriate and compassionate solution. All of us come into this kind of debate from personal experience. It's not an area that Christian people are either exempt from or are unfamiliar with. Priests, clergy, lay people sit with those who are dying, and sometimes those who are dying difficult and painful deaths on a week-by-week basis. We are familiar with that context and those situations, and none of us are immune from the impact that that suffering has on us. For myself, in the case of my own family, my parents died within just a few months of each other. My mother had suffered an aneurysm, brain aneurysm, some years prior to her death, and had become someone that we didn't recognise and that we didn't know. She had a reasonable quality of life, but she had little memory. She struggled to remember and to know us. My father suffered from a chronic degenerative disease, which meant that he was gradually losing control over all of the muscles in his body. And had that disease gone to its natural conclusion, the last reflex that he would have been able to control was his ability to swallow, and so he would have literally choked to death. Mercifully, pneumonia in the end took his life. However, for that 2.5 years, I found myself thinking constantly about his quality of life, what might give some relief, and of course thought about whether the only humane response was to assist him to slip away. We were really afraid for him, and he was afraid for himself. So we do understand the nature of human suffering. We do understand its consequences, and we live this life. Question that we are really seeking to answer is, do I have a right to die? And religious believers, Christian believers, answer for themselves that they don't. For a believer to say, the time could come when I find myself in a situation that has no meaning, and I reserve the right to end my life in such a situation, would be to say that there is some aspect of human life where God cannot intervene, where God can't break through. It would be to say that when I as an individual can no longer give meaning to my life, it has no value. And human dignity is best served by ending it. So that would be, in the eyes of most traditional believers, Christian or otherwise, an admission that faith had failed. It would imply that life at a certain level of suffering or incapacity simply could no longer be lived in relation to God or in relationship with God. So that's the nub, in my view, of the debate from a Christian perspective. In terms of the Bible, there is a range of perspectives around the taking of life. At its most fundamental, in the Ten Commandments, the commandment, thou shalt not kill. And yet, Christian believers, those who stand in the Judeo-Christian tradition, have said, yes, that's true, except in self-defense. Some argue that there is such a thing as a just war, where killing, although reprehensible and regrettable, is a lesser evil. And there are those Christians who argue for the death penalty in relation to certain horrific crimes. Let's just explore some of the basic principles that Christians, religious believers, bring to this debate. The first is, we say that lives belong to God, that the ultimate authority in matters of life and death rests solely with God, from whom all life derives. Life fundamentally is a gift. It's a loan, if you like. It's held by us in trust. Secondly, we say that we are made in the very image of God, and we have responsibility for the way we steward that life, and indeed the whole of the created universe. Thirdly, we say that God became one with us in the person, in the human being, Jesus Christ. That human life, as seen in the person of Jesus, tells us that human life, that humanity, is something about which God is earnestly, even ultimately concerned, and that we therefore must also be concerned about human life and its sanctity. We say that we bear responsibility for others. Throughout the Bible, the assertion is that human life is precious and holy, and that all people, well or ill, are created in God's image, and bearing the stamp of their Creator, are equal before God and God's love. We say that our individual human life and human worth does not depend upon ability or gifts or capacity or even the quality of our life, but rather on our status as being made in God's image and likeness, and bearing the worth and the value that God laid upon us when God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. So those of us who handle our lives as a divine loan, redeemed by Christ, will of necessity treat the life and the lives of others with profound respect. There's a time to live and a time to die, and it's not in the individual's authority to choose this time, any more than control is given over the time of birth. For the Christian, death might be welcomed with a clearly positive dimension, but we dare not transform this positive welcoming of death into a right to die. So that's some of the kind of principles that we bring to bear as Christians, and there's lots of theological debate around each of those principles, but they are the ones that we need to reflect on, think about and discuss. So here's a question: does the sanctity of life mean the prolongation of life at all costs for Christians? Does the sanctity of life mean the prolongation of life at all costs for Christians? If the worst thing that can happen to us is physical death, then we have an obligation to prolong life at all costs. But Christians say that death is not the end, but is the entering into a new and more complete relationship with God. So, is there a distinction between the prolongation of life and the prolongation of the act of dying. Now, this question is compounded by advances in medicine. A doctor fights to prolong life, but at what point does this obligation cease? Let's just recognise in this complex area, and there's so much more to say and to think about, that advances in medical science has meant that life is prolonged way past points that in the past would have seen a life brought to an end, seen a person die. Now, with that said, let's just make some distinctions between different forms of euthanasia. And these are crude definitions, I accept that. But it's helpful for our understanding and our debate in society to just think about the sort of spectrum that we're talking about. I want to talk about, firstly, compulsory euthanasia, where there is external administration of that which brings about the death, and the decision-making is external to the position of the person whose life is ended. Now, extreme arguments suggest that those who are severely physically deformed, or those who are seriously mentally, I'm going to use the word defective, should be brought to an end. Such lives should be euthanized. Part of that discussion around compulsory euthanasia also extends to adults who are incurably ill. But let's remember that there is a distinction between injecting to relieve pain in such a way that it may reduce the length of someone's life, and injecting with the deliberate intention of ending that life there and then. There is also some definitions around voluntary euthanasia, where the request is made by an incurably and terminally ill individual at a point where they are cognitively able to knowingly make that request, so perhaps in a kind of living will, or perhaps in full awareness but in intolerable pain, or in the lead up to a death which they know will involve intolerable pain, or where they believe that the quality of their life has reduced to such a point that they request for a gentle and easy death. There is, for some in this debate, a kind of utilitarian principle which sees pain as absolute, as an absolute evil, and that euthanasia therefore should be mandatory for dying sufferers, anyone who is in chronic and acute pain. So into this debate and the range of possibilities that are being discussed, and I've only touched on some, there is a range also of Christian positions, and you can see those Christian positions outlined in the two submissions that went from our church. The first submission signed by a large proportion of the current House of Bishops, or the House of Bishops that was in place at that time, and then a submission signed by 3 bishops. And those two submissions, while very similar in many ways, also had a fundamental difference. The larger group took a more traditional Christian stance, and the smaller group of 3, what might be described as a situational Christian stance. So firstly, in terms of the traditional Christian stance, Christians would say that no one is entitled to take life. Life does not have absolute value, but disposal of life, the ending of life, is in the hands of God. That suffering is itself not an absolute evil, and often there is real concern expressed in Christian submissions around the kind of thin edge of the wedge or the slippery slope, concern that if you begin to allow, it will just move much more towards the compulsory euthanasia end of the spectrum that we've already touched on. The situational Christian stance affirms the sanctity of the human person, the human personality, and the evolving nature of the relationship with God and with other human beings. That God does not will the prolongation of human suffering for the benefit of the soul of the sufferer. It's not God's will. And that a life of pain without cure is not life. And so therefore, assisted dying, voluntary euthanasia, is in some circumstances acceptable to a Christian position. So let me just conclude by explaining where I've got to, and I just offer this to you as my, I hope, thought through and thoughtful position, but I am committed to continuing to engage in the debate, and my position may change. But in terms of coming to this position, it seems to me that the right to die debate is somewhat ambiguous, but it does cover three demands. The first is that the individual has the right to choose to live or to die, and that the medical profession should assist. Secondly, that a doctor, with the patient's permission and under certain circumstances, should be free to administer drugs potentially death-inducing, if possible, to control pain in the terminally ill. Thirdly, that a patient in extremis should not be subjected to troublesome treatment which cannot restore the person to health, and the use of drugs that may induce death, may speed up the coming of death in order to relieve pain, is perfectly acceptable. Now, my position is that the third of those options is not euthanasia. That many situations involving euthanasia would be covered if the limits to attempts to prolong life were given wider recognition. Indirect euthanasia is, if you like, a problem of medical success. I do believe that death is not intrinsically negative. I do believe there is a need for proper care of the dying. I think we invest far too little resource in supporting those who are dying, in providing accessible hospice care for everyone, where the dignity of dying, the anxiety and the fear of being alone, of not being supported, is addressed through good resourcing of support of families and of professionals. I do believe that changes to the legislation as proposed in the current bill would cause much more evil and more problems than it overcomes, and I do think that such a system would be open to abuse. I do believe that love is better served in accompanying the person in their dying, and I don't believe that the law should be built on exceptional circumstances, and that, I fear, is what these proposals are. The responsibility of freedom under God now includes the action of suspended treatment or the acceleration of pain-killing drugs that will shorten life. That shortening of life through the administration of pain-killing drugs, I think, can be an expression of love. and is not euthanasia. What I think is fundamentally at stake in this legislation is the question, does the right to an assisted death entail a responsibility on others to kill? That's a very, very sharply focused question, and one that we need to consider. Look, thank you again for allowing me to speak into this debate. It's something that we will have to work hard on as a Christian community as we build our understanding of these really difficult but profound issues. They are issues that go right to the heart of who we are as human beings.